In our culture, people often gather together in recognition of major life events. The birth of a baby, a baptism or bar mitzvah, a wedding ceremony, an anniversary, even special holidays bring families and even friends together, and many times they engage in various ceremonies or traditions, maybe even some rituals that have deeper meaning. Susan and I are convinced that at the end of life, such a gathering is also a very important aspect of what happens in recognition of the person's life and what has occurred in the death as well. So we're very happy that you have joined us for a little while to talk about the power and the purpose of funeral events. I'm Dr. Robert C. DeVries. I'm an ordained pastor and a seminary professor. I've served churches in a variety of places, and I'm happy that we're able to be with you today. Susan and I have been married to each other for a number of years, but prior to that, my first wife died in 1993. But Susan and I have been privileged to speak at a number of national conferences and some local workshops, working with funeral directors, local hospices, and other grief groups. And so we are really delighted that you are able to be with us to talk about the power and the purpose of funeral events.
I'm likewise pleased to join you. I'm Dr. Susan Zonnebelt-Smeenge, a licensed clinical psychologist and RN, and professionally I've dealt a lot with dying, grief, and loss. I did doctoral dissertation work, and at least half of my practice dealt with people who were facing death or grieving. Also, though, I've had personal experience that I bring to this table, and that is, in my 20s, all 4 of my grandparents died. In my 30s, my 33-year-old brother died in a tragic plane crash. And when I was 46, I was widowed after my first husband had a malignant brain tumor for 18 years. So taking that expertise along with the fact that Bob has had a lot of loss experiences and professionally helped people who were grieving, we've written 4 books on grief and 1 on facing death. So let's look a minute at the question that's being asked in society about, are funeral events even necessary anymore? Do we really need those? Or have they become so defunct? And when we look at our culture, it is concerning because some of the values seem to be quick and painless and easy. And so when a loved one dies, they try to apply those also to what are we going to do. Let's have a disposal of the body in a quick way, and maybe we don't even need funeral events for that. But when we look at quick, if things happen quickly when it comes to funerals or not having funerals, it doesn't help people really file in long-term memory what's happened. And painless, it can't be painless when we experience the death of somebody who we're very attached to, care about deeply, and love. So we're bound to have pain. And easy, we know psychologically that if somebody tries to do things easily, it's going to really hold them back in a healthy grief journey. Actually, it's facing the pain that helps people heal on their grief journey, by facing it, by doing the tough stuff. So let's ask, has this always been the case that people are wondering, are funeral events even necessary? And no, it hasn't been. In fact, if we examine civilizations and cultures for the last 300,000 years, they've all had 3 things in common. The first is that they've had some ritual or ceremony when somebody dies. The second is they find a way to actually memorialize that person. And third, they find a sacred place for the final resting place of their deceased. So the customs obviously vary depending on the location of the different civilization, and also religious or non-religious beliefs and the culture. But nonetheless, they have used some ritual to recognize that a significant event has happened. In the United States, as immigrants came from other countries, they brought their customs with them. And we know from historical data that pioneers, when they were going from the East Coast to the West Coast, they would always stop when somebody died and have a service to pay some respects before they moved on again in their wagon train. As rural populations developed, as people kind of formed communities, death in a rural community affected that entire group, and they all came together to offer support to those people who were dying, and food, and just really gave them the idea that they were cared about. As things progressed, funeral events were really held in homes, and in fact, I can remember my grandparents talking about their parents being laid out on the parlor table and people coming and visiting, paying their respects to the deceased and to the bereaved at that time. So we haven't always had to ask the question, are funeral events necessary?
As Susan mentioned, a lot of funerals in the old days were held in the homes where people were laid out, perhaps in the dining room table. But American wars and the Industrial Revolution following that really began to change funeral practices in the United States. Actually, embalming was first used in the Civil War to help bring soldiers home who had lost their lives in battle so that the families could honor their death in a respectable way. And after the war, this custom of embalming was really generalized to almost all of society, again to allow people to travel some distance because travel was so slow so they could participate in that funeral service. As larger cities developed, there was not enough room in the homes to do these funerals. People were living in smaller homes or they were living in tiny little apartments, and people weren't so much of a community as they were in rural populations, and that led to the development of funeral parlors, that is, homes that funeral directors would purchase in order to substitute for the rural home that people used to use. And actually, that's where the word undertaker came from as well, because these funeral directors would undertake to do the funeral on behalf of the family. And so with the Industrial Revolution, a major change began to happen in funeral service.
We've just finished talking a little bit about the historical perspective of funeral events, but let's talk now about the trends that really fuel some of the wondering about funeral events in the United States today. Certainly, one of the characteristics is that people are now looking at how they can make the funeral events more convenient. After somebody dies in all the plans, they don't really want to inconvenience people, and so they're looking again for quick, painless, and easy ways to do funeral events. There seems to be a decreased loyalty in community events, in joining different things, and even in joining church. The focus tends to be much more on individual preference, what works out best in my life, what are my needs and my wants, without a whole lot of consideration for how that affects the group or the rest of the people who are involved. And really alarmingly, there's less emphasis on tradition and ritual. And we think it's because people don't really understand the importance of ritual and what ritual actually does. Scientifically, neurobiologists have found that when people participate in a ritual, that it helps connect the left and the right hemisphere of one's brain. There's a connecting point that helps make sense of what's going on, because we're combining logic and self-soothing together. And so people who have ritual at the time of death for funeral events really have far less of a hard time accepting the reality of the death and actually helping themselves to face some of the emotional components that are involved in that. Another trend is really the personalization of funeral events, so that we really get a good look at who was this person who died, what was that person's worth, what were that person's interests and contributions, and that really is a psychologically healthy component that's now developing more and more, where we really do honor and pay tribute to the person who died.
In addition to the 5 trends that Susan just outlined, perhaps one of the biggest trends, the biggest change in about 150 years in funeral practice, is the increased use of cremation. As a matter of fact, in the last 10 or 15 years, the use of cremation has skyrocketed extremely much. The National Funeral Directors Association estimates that in the state of Michigan, for example, in 2010, cremations accounted for 40%, 4 out of 10 of the services that we are involved. And as Susan said, that often results in a far less traditional service because it makes things more convenient for families. They're doing it not only because they think that it costs less, but I think it's because of what we've been saying all along, to make the whole event of funerals a lot more convenient, less painful, and easy. And therefore, we also have that rise of what we now know as memorial services, becoming increasingly popular. Memorial services typically are ones that happen after the body has been cremated, the casket is no longer visible, maybe there's a picture of the deceased person at best. And memorial services also tend to be celebrative in nature and not really giving much place for the sadness and the grief that the people are then feeling.
Along with the trends, some perspectives have changed in some factions of our society. There are some beliefs that are rather concerning for mental health professionals, and one of those is that there's really no need to cause the family more pain. They've been through enough. Let's not even have a funeral. We don't really need one. It's not necessary. And yet psychologically, what people aren't recognizing is that it is facing the pain that helps people heal. Another perspective that is untrue is that the family has already done all their grieving as the person was dying. This is if the person died from a lingering illness, that they saw that person lose function bit after bit, and along with that, the family, people who were close, were grieving. But that doesn't take the place of post-death grieving. It's still very necessary because there's no way to grieve ahead of time the death of a person and the absence of that person's body and that person's presence in being in one's life. There are also some further beliefs, perspectives about funerals, that they're an unnecessary expense, that the family can just do it themselves, that you don't need the expertise of a funeral director. And that just makes absolutely no sense to Bob and me, because we hire experts to do so many things, even household repairs, and yet when something so significant as the death of a loved one happens, we don't want to hire a funeral director who obviously has spent his or her life doing that. They have a lot of know-how about what things maybe are very important, what ritual is significant to help people heal. They're also very good at helping people make decisions about what to have and bringing family together, sometimes resolving conflicts so that the family can approach the funeral events with more unity and perhaps family support. And as far as the expense goes, the funeral directors I know are very willing to talk about budget and what's going to work, but from our perspective, having something with a funeral director guiding that is far better than having nothing.
You've heard us use words like ceremony, tradition, ritual throughout this presentation. We want to clarify a little bit what we mean by them, because these definitions are not necessarily discrete. They blend together a little bit. But ceremony really are those things that we do kind of as a family or as a group that's designed by protocol or convention. There's a certain ceremony that we go through, for example, with weddings. And even though there may be some individual differences, the basic elements of the ceremony are usually always there. Tradition, on the other hand, looks toward the past. It's the thing that we have always done in the past. It's kind of defined by our cultural continuity, so that we know what we need to do because this is the way our parents did it, or the rest of our community has always done it that way. Ritual, on the other hand, are all of those actions that we use to give symbolic value to a deeper meaning, something that's going on within inside of us that we have difficulty expressing in words. That's particularly true